Hey everyone, welcome to Career Journeys brought to you by Career Companion. We're here with Jacob Richter, who is the CTO of Propeller. Thank you for taking the time to join us today.
No worries.
And so, for people who don't know what a CTO is, could you give us a bit of an overview?
Sure. I mean, CTO is something I probably can't tell you what CTOs do in general because it's something very different at every company. But maybe I can take you through, I guess, what I did and how my roles adapted. So essentially, what I head up at the moment is our product and engineering teams. So everything from the teams that build the bits and pieces, like writing the code and designing the hardware and those types of things, all the way through to the product side. So doing the road mapping and product discovery and customer interviews and things like that. Now what do I own across those bits and pieces, or what do I do on a day to day basis? I guess as the company grows and as my career has evolved, you have to look more further forward, right? So I'm less and less in the day to day thing, solving active problems that are happening, and much more in the hey, what are we doing kind of next quarter? What are we doing next year? That's kind of where my head's at. So what do I do on a day to day now? It's people things. So in charge of the teams in general, their happiness, their career conversations, their salaries, all those types of things. Ultimately falls onto me, and I work with our people team to do that. The process, so how we work has an engine, how product interfaces with engineering, the rest of the company, design, all those bits and pieces. I work with the team to figure all those bits and pieces out. And then, as I said, the strategy as well, right? So I play really close attention to the product managers and the CEO, and we all work together to figure out, hey, what's the product we're building today? What do we want that to look like tomorrow? And kind of how do we get there? So very broad. I apologize because it is a bit of a broad role. Like essentially, you don't know what I'm going to do from a day to day basis. Things pop up that need to be solved, but that's basically what I do as a CTO.
Yeah, sounds like a super important role. I've worked with quite a few CTOs, so I know how busy you can be in your day to day. So, I guess for yourself, and so we can sort of paint a picture for everyone out there to get to a CTO level, because obviously you're managing quite a lot of different teams and trying to, move sort of chess pieces and that sort of stuff around. We'll sort of go back to the beginning in a second of how you
Mm-hmm.
got to where you are. But for people out there to get a really good understanding of sort of, the impressive position that you're in, I know there's quite a few different ways of getting into your role, but what are sort of the most common, steps that people would jump through career-wise when it comes to job titles, for example?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I guess it's where I'm in the startup world, right? So I can only talk about it from that perspective, right? So the broader CTOs at your bigger corporates and your banks and bits and pieces, that's a very different career trajectory, right? CIOs and CTOs. So I can't comment on any of that stuff.
Hmm.
But I think, how do you become a CTO in startup land? It's either you form a company and you're a CTO, by
Yeah.
default as part of that, or basically, the most normal way you kind of go in this direction is you probably start on the tools as an engineer. You'll grow your hard skills. So hard skills, as I label it, your coding ability or your systems engineering or your firmware engineering, something like that until you become more senior and maybe a senior engineer or a staff engineer, whereby probably somebody will come to you at that point and be like, hey, are you interested in managing people? And then you probably say, yep, I would like to manage a team of people. And then that's how you go in that directory, sorry, in that direction. And then those kind of things kind of just cascade and snowball, right? So really, for me, I guess the approach that I took, which is the approach that I would recommend everybody takes, is just focus on not necessarily, yeah, the title or growing your career or anything like that. It's like, what's the biggest problem for the business, right? So you got to think bigger and broader than yourself at every point, no matter what your position is, no matter how many people you manage or how experienced you are, right? Like, what's the problems that the business have that I, as an individual, can solve? And then essentially, what happens over time is as the business grows, if you're in a growing business, fingers crossed, that's great. you'll have to overcome these problems. Nobody else will be thinking about them because there might not be an incumbent CTO or anything like that. And then just as a result of that, essentially you find yourself in a leadership position, for lack of a better word, whereby essentially you're already doing the role, you've got the role. You might not have the title yet, but then that's kind of what naturally cascades back through that title.
Yeah, fantastic. And I guess for yourself, obviously, there would have come that fork in the road where it could have been, let's keep leaning on those hard skills and become, I guess, the best that I can be in those hard skills,
Yep.
or actually, I want to be more of that sort of strategic overview, more people management, and
Yep.
head down that route. When you got to that, I guess, position, how did you make that decision?
Yeah, and I think this is the bit that is different in every company, right?
Yes.
So some companies need somebody that's much more technical focused as their CTO, right? So they follow the more technical track in terms of, senior engineer, more experienced staff, maybe principal or something like that, and then you become a CTO. And you often find that in startups that have CTOs as the first person in the company, right? Because usually what happens is that person's very technical and they always want to stay technical. In my case, I guess, like, well, for Propeller, let's talk through that lens. We already had really strong engineers, right? I wasn't the strongest engineer at Propeller. I'll never be the strongest engineer at Propeller. We already have that scratch itched. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Like that's okay at Propeller. What really then required us to go to that next level, right, is we didn't really have structured people, we didn't really have structured process or anything like that, which basically pulled me more into that management direction. Again, I didn't want to be pulled into the management direction, right? Like it's easier to be frank to go into the technical direction, but for me, to make Propeller the best place it could be from an engineering and from a product perspective, those things needed to be solved. So whilst I was hired as a technical person, as an engineer, I put my time in that direction because I knew, like, if I invested time here and made all this stuff better, Propeller as a company would be, better overall, right? For me, when I joined Propeller, it had, very technical engineers already in it. So much more technical than I will ever be or that I could ever be, right? And that's what the company was kind of formed off, all these technical people. So when I joined then, we didn't have a problem with technical skills that needed to be solved. What we had a problem with was growing our people to make sure that they're happy and engaged and continue to work at Propeller. It's whether our processes were scalable, right, all the way through from the talking to customers through to planning to the delivery, all those things. And essentially whether we could grow as a company, not from an architecture or a technology standpoint, of course those things are important, but more from a team perspective, how we could we double tomorrow and then double the next day and have a scalable, personnel tree that would reflect that. That's where the bigger problems were for me when I joined, and that's why I focused on those problems. Not because I had to, right? My job title wasn't that; it was software engineer. I was expected to work on the tools, but for me, there was much more bang for buck for the company if I focused and solving those problems, which ultimately would kind of continue to benefit us now. So that's where I put more of my focus, and that's what ultimately pulled me off that technical back to there. And never say never as well, right? Like I might, and I probably will go back to technical at some point, but it's just where I am at the moment.
That sounds great. And there's a couple of things that I sort of want to touch on there. One of them being, like you said, you're a software engineer. That wasn't necessarily your role. And we've spoken to quite a lot of people about this, and they sort of, say similar things as swimming in two different lanes. Like you're doing your current job, but then at the same time, you're thinking about that next stepping stone that you want to get into. And we always try to talk about being open with your managers, setting goals and saying this is what I want to do and these are my ideas. Obviously, that's a pretty daunting thing, I guess, to be a software engineer and then go, "Hey, I want to be a CTO." How did you have those conversations internally to make that happen?
Um, Again, I didn't, right? So
Yeah.
this is the difference between a smaller startup and a
Hmm.
larger company, right? You don't have the frameworks in place for those. Honestly, before I moved into head of engineering, there wasn't really formal career conversations at Propeller in the engineering team, right? So there wasn't there wasn't really anybody I could have those conversations with. But because the team is small and nimble, right? Like essentially what it was, or what it escalated to, was I was already doing this job, right? So I was already doing the job of, well, a head of engineering, working across the teams, making us as a unit more effective. And then essentially when push came to shove, and when performance review came up, or whatever it was, we discussed kind of openly, like, hey, maybe there is value in me doing this with more of my time, getting less off the tools and being able to grow the engineering team in general as this head of engineering role. And that's what's pulled me there. Now, in a more formal company, of course, it's harder to move into these positions, right? Because they will probably have CTOs already, and there will be a predefined career track, which does make it easier and harder in some ways, because you'll know who to talk to, when to talk to them, and about what. In a startup, though, like, again, it wasn't a thing, me shooting for that next stepping stone. It was a problem, and I was solving it, and then the role kind of evolved over time. It was very natural, I think, from that perspective.
Amazing. And I guess for all the people probably listening, going, can you, Sam, stop asking questions and please ask what Propeller is? Can you give us an overview of what Propeller actually is?
Yeah. So Propeller is many things, but essentially what we do, we're a hardware and a software company. So we make hardware just as well as software, and we employ both types of engineers. What we do for our customers is make them manage their work sites more effectively. So that's a very broad term. Basically, work sites these days have drones that fly them to do surveying, and what we do as a platform is essentially ingest drone data as well as various other bits of data, process that, and produce high quality 3D survey grade maps, right? So then what a customer can do using those maps is communicate effectively with the field, like, hey, this thing needs to be dug out to meet this target or whatever, and allow them to catch either incorrect work or mistakes as early as possible, and to track their progress over time. So all those things are quite difficult. So we do that as the foundation, and then, as I said, now we're kind of evolving as a platform to be much more of a embedded geospatial information system. That's a big word, I apologize about that, but basically it's to get all the people on the field using our data on a day-to-day basis, capturing data, sending it back to the office, just so these organizations and these projects work more in sync. Because for these large, like, construction sites, quarries, landfills, mines, and bits and pieces, there's potentially thousands of people working on those sites, and they don't really have a single source of truth that they can operate from. So that's basically what Propeller does.
Super cool. That's really interesting, and I'm sure everyone's happy now that you've given an overview, because they've probably been waiting for that since the start of this conversation. So no, that's great. Sounds really interesting, and that you're having to be a part, or I guess, of lots of different facets of the business. I guess let's rewind all the way back now and sort of talk through your journey and how you got to where you are. I love asking this question. In high school, what did you want to be? Did you want to be a CTO of a startup, or what did you think?
In high school, there wasn't really startups, to be
Yeah.
honest, right? Like, it wasn't a thing. So in high school, my main focus was in science, right? And that's kind of where it evolved into. I was like, I don't really, well, to be honest, I didn't really know what I wanted to be, but I knew that wanted to go to university. So the direction I took was the science route. I didn't do computing or anything like that. So it was only kind of pure science, the physics and the math elements. But yeah, that was basically where I thought I would go in high school.
And then so you went off, did a university degree. Did you? How long did that take of your life, and how
Yep,
much
yep.
did that take up?
Yeah, went and did university degree, as I said. So math and physics. Why math and physics? I was interested in that. I did engineering in high school as well, but I did
Mhm.
like the sciencey side more.
Yeah.
So that was a 3 year degree, and then every science student, well, not every science student, I shouldn't say that. I take that back. A lot of science students then is kind of expected, if you go the academic route, you go then through the honours and the PhD form, right? So you got to do honours first, and then you go do your PhD to become a physicist or a mathematician or whatever it was. So I finished the degree. That was fine. That took 3 years. Then started honours and started doing honours, and it wasn't really until honours where you actually you don't really know what a scientist does until you get to honors, right? Like that's basically you do bigger projects, you work in a science team. And it wasn't until that point where I was like, maybe this isn't quite the right environment for me. So it was basically doing honors, doing my research project, and working in the team where I was like, nah, it's not really for me. And I ended up not finishing honors. At the same time, I moved on to basically what into startup world as part of that.
Okay, so whilst you were sort of in honors, you started working on the side in the sort of a field that you wanted to work in like a
Correct.
part-time job, or was it something that you started creating on your own?
A bit of both, right? So weirdly enough, I actually worked in a mobile phone repair shop, so fixing phones
Mm.
back in the days when they used to be much more fixable. I like the engineering side of pieces, and I like working with my hands. So I did that as a part-time job to see me through university. And basically, as part of that, the person who owned that business was very entrepreneurial, and they had a lot of ideas around a couple of businesses. And I joined, and I had the skill set that I did from my science side and computing skills, because I had to do that with my I learned them as part of science and my research projects. And basically, we got talking, and we're like, yeah, maybe this could be an area that I could help you with, right? And then that kind of spawned off into first startup world, which continued for many years, right? So I was in that first one for 4 years. I didn't call myself a CTO. Again, titles are not important in these situations, but I basically fulfilled that more technical role as part of that startup. And it grew and it shrunk like startups do, and then I eventually left that startup, but it's still going, for instance.
Ah, cool. And I guess for people as well, like it can be quite confusing now because there is physical engineering, I guess, when it comes to hardware, and there is now software developers. Back in my day, what they were called software devs, they're now called engineers as well. So did you start off more in that hardware engineering and then transition into software engineering? How did that sort of happen?
For me, I was both already, right?
Yeah.
So I guess that's the interesting thing about doing physics as a background. You do electronics and you do computing, right? So you are a little bit more broad based. Now, I don't pretend to be a hardware or firmware engineer, right? That's a whole nother class, and that's really a specialty, right? They spend 4 years learning that. As physics, you do it for a couple of semesters at most, right? So I was very broad based. Yeah, I don't have a comp science degree or a computer engineering degree or anything like that. So really, what pushed me in a certain direction was when we made this first startup, it was very hybrid. It was half a startup, or half a hardware startup and half a software startup. And the other co-founder was better at the hardware side, right? So that kind of pushed me more towards the software elements, which forced me to learn those bits and pieces. But I would still say I was very hybrid in both of those elements. I guess you couldn't usually, to be a firmware engineer, you need more formal qualifications, which I didn't have in this area. So that's why I guess naturally over my time I've gone more towards the direction of software.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I guess for people as well, for my interest, when going into that startup space, obviously there's not going to be that, I guess, immediate revenue stream because you're going into what I would like most startups, if you think about it out loud, are going into a passion point and something that they really want to drive, and they're starting it out, like you said, with maybe one other person, not necessarily got the client base and that sort of stuff. Was that daunting? At any point did you have to go, okay, well, how am I going to budget this? Like, what sort of ran through your head, and was there a point where you almost didn't do it, or were you 100% just in from the start?
Yeah, I mean, for me, again, like this was more than a decade ago, right? So the Sydney startup scene was completely different to what it is today. There was only a few startups. There was some startup hubs. So Fishburners was there, as well as a few others, but it wasn't a thing, right? We didn't talk about startups in university. Nobody that I knew was in startups. None of my family knew what a startup was. Very different place. So when I pursued this area, for instance, like honestly, I didn't really think about the longer term prospects, right? Because for me, it was either academia or something else, and this was the something else that filled that void. I guess fortunately, for me, I also had like a partner who was working at the time, or part-time working, so I could still part-time work on weekends and things like that to bring enough money in to keep it going. But yeah, it was hard, right? It was basically 4 years without a paycheck, right? So we had to figure out how to make that work. But again, that's kind of that's the pressure of a startup is because you have to make money, you have to feed yourself, you have to make a product that fits the market and people want to buy. And again, all this kind of stuff cascades to building all the experience as quickly as possible.
Mm. And I love how you sort of touched on like 10 years ago, it's a completely different landscape and everything. And, we always talk about the importance of networking. And I feel in this day and age, networking is now a lot larger thing, easier to come by. Not saying that it's disregarding that it's not a hard thing to do. But back then, did this involve a lot of networking, or how did that sort of happen?
Didn't need to, right? To honestly, yeah, it's not what we were trying to solve back then was a technological problem, right? It was a technological problem that hadn't been solved before. So networking wouldn't really get you out of that. The only network, in terms of my personal development, right? Like we just had to figure it out. The only networking we had to do was basically to grow the business or grow the product, right? That involved certain networking in certain spheres of people to kind of get our idea out there. So we did have to do that as part of the job. But yeah, for me, personal networking was actually quite limited beyond talking to maybe people at startup events, if there was startup events, talking to people at university because we were just across the road from university. That was basically the extent of people I could really talk to.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. And like you said, you were there for around 4 years. What was the next step in your career, and how did you make the decision to? Because I can only assume it was like your baby to then sort of
Yeah,
move on
yeah.
to another role.
Yeah, I guess quarter life crisis, right? Like basically, if you this is the dark side of startups, right?
Mhm.
If you have a startup that doesn't succeed for a very long time, you are usually in a very big deficit of budget and anxiety and bits and pieces like that. So it was a bit of a cascade of those things, and essentially at the end of that, I was like, you know what, maybe this world isn't for me, and left, and then actually kind of had a mini career change as a management consultant for a few years, and got into that, learned lots of skills which are great, particularly on the bigger end of town, because we work with large customers and bits and pieces like that. But ultimately, actually, I only kind of deviated for a few years, and then I came back to startups after it. So yeah, I obviously like it here, and I do enjoy what I do, and I think I've gotten a lot better at it now. So even though I've come back into this world, the experience that I've learned has meant that I haven't been into that nasty spot that I was in that first startup.
Interesting. And how did you find I trying to it was almost like you were starting from scratch again. Like what
Yep.
thought process did you have to go through to be like, okay, I've done this now, and these are the sort of skills and lessons that I've learned, but now I'm going to go do this. Like how, because I feel a lot of people that I talk to find it hard they go, look, I've done this, I'm stuck in a rut, I'm not liking what I'm doing anymore. How do I even think about what I want to do next? So how did you get to that conclusion?
Yeah, I was in the same spot, right? Like basically I was somebody who had a bachelor's degree, didn't finish honors, had this company for 4 years, but with nothing to show for it either. The company was actually a little bit like secret, so there was no like material out there that I could point to. So for me, really, the only thing I knew that I could do really well was figure out and problem solve, right? So and I was obviously good at the technology stuff, right? And the technology stuff is obviously the programming bits, but I actually think just understanding data and analyzing data, that was my strong spot from my physics math background. So I look for jobs where you need to understand and analyze data and you need to problem solve, and that basically is what pushed me into management consultancy. So that's they solve management consultancy very broad, lots of different things, but the area that I was interested in, particularly the financial analysis side of things, or the IT financial analysis, that's what suited me. And usually also those areas don't need super formal qualifications on any of those things. So that's what sounded good. Thought I'd give it a go, and basically went that direction.
Amazing. So basically, if we cut it to black and white, you came up with what are my strengths? What do I enjoy doing? I'm going to go research what jobs need
Yeah,
that and
yeah,
then apply. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Fantastic. And then, like you said, you were there for a couple of years, which gave you a really good, broader understanding of maybe some skills that you might not have acquired. And then
yeah,
what pulled you back into the startups? What made you come back?
yeah. Like what what I really like about startups is the hustle, right? So the hustle, as I said before, because you need to build something that works and that people will pay for, otherwise you won't succeed, right? And that means that forces you then to build and think as fast as possible, right? And you don't have that in management consultancy, and you also don't have ownership in management consultancy because you usually do a project for a customer, give it to the customer, wash your hands, and walk away, right? So whatever you conceive of or think of, or whatever process works or something, you ultimately don't execute on. You'll never have the chance to improve it. It's just set and forget. And I didn't like that aspect about it. I like the work we do, of course, and I like the customers and kind of the help we did, and the company, of course. But yeah, I didn't like that lack of ownership. So that's why at the end of that, I was basically like, okay, let's we're in a better position now in terms of mentally, and I was ready to basically go again, right? Like I'd recovered, and that's what pulled me back into. I started like a little startup on the side for a couple of months, just with a few people in Canberra where I was at. Didn't really work out. That's okay because I got back into the feel of things, and then ended up moving back to Sydney again to join or form another startup with another bunch of guys that we worked on for a few years.
Yeah, amazing. And I guess as well, that's my filler word. Sorry for this, I guess. So for people who, because I see it a lot now, a lot of people are quite entrepreneurial. There's lots of opportunities out there now with technology to do so.
Yeah,
But look, I can't. I personally, I was a photographer for 5 years and then changed careers into sales. I've done a couple of small little like side businesses on myself. What would be your advice to people? Because it seems like you're very switched on to know when to jump and go, okay, I've invested this amount of time into this startup and this idea. And you seem to know the right time to get out. Whereas I know for me personally, and might be for other people, once I've got an idea in my head, like I want to go like
yeah,
full,
yeah,
full leather and I want to execute it. And it's, knowing when to fold.
yeah.
How do you do that when assess it and go, okay, this is the right time?
Yeah, yeah. Again, I think for me, I've lived it, right? So I've lived the case where I didn't call it early, and I knew I know what happens when you don't do that. So basically, I think that's what that's really grown in me is being able to be like, hey, as early as possible in a project, plan out at X date, we want to have X many customers or X revenue or something like that. And if we don't get to that point at that time, or there's no pathway of doing that, then that's where I basically go, you know what, this isn't going to work. It's not because the idea might not ever work. It just might not be the right time, right place, right people for it to work. But again, you need to be fast in this space with any business creation. And I think, yeah, setting those reasonable objectives or targets up front is what allows me now to be like, yep, this is something that we should stop working on, or something that we should start working on or continue to work on. Again,
Yeah.
it's you've just got to kind of feel it out, to be honest. And like now I've been in what, 6 or 7 startups or something like that, most of which haven't succeeded. So I've kind of built that muscle myself. It doesn't transfer to others' shared learnings, right? Yeah, it's just you got to get in there and try it out, and then if it's not looking good, make sure you write down numbers or targets that you want to hit. Otherwise, yeah, just pull out as early as possible. Otherwise, you will go insane.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
great,
yeah,
great. No, that's a really good idea of doing it. And look, I've personally worked for a startup myself. I worked for them. And I've also worked for larger corporate organizations. They're very, like you said, very different in the way that they work. So I think what
yeah,
would be sort of beneficial, especially in the position that you're in now, where you've managed people and teams, What kind of like, because anyone listening to this could be like, yeah, startup sounds great. I get to be, working really agile and being across lots of different things, wearing many hats.
Yeah.
And it can be quite a daunting thing once you actually get in there.
Yeah.
What kind of, I guess, in your time, what people have you seen personality wise or work wise being successful in these types of environments? And
Yeah.
then what type of people have you seen come in with, I guess, really excitement and open eyes and have just crashed and burned?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, like it changes as the company grows, right? But people who join or start, let's say, people who start companies or join companies, with the expectation of, I'm going to be fair, making money, I think is immediately in the wrong headspace, right? Like because they're trying to chase down that side, they're trying to grow or climb the corporate ladder or whatever. That isn't what makes startups successful, right? Startups successful, the people who join them are super ambitious. So by ambitious, I mean not like going, making friends at high places and bits and pieces like that. I mean like if there's something problem to be solved, they don't shy away from it, right? They tackle it. They're confident enough to tackle that problem. So that means people who are self-starters, people who are super eager to learn, right? Super eager to learn, and people who like to make mistakes. I think that's probably one of the big ones, right? It's people who don't shut down when they make a mistake, or maybe their business doesn't work, maybe their feature doesn't work, maybe they get critical feedback. It's not the people who shut down when they do that aren't fast and agile in their personal development, right? So you need people who can take that feedback on, whether that's a fallen company or a fallen feature or critical feedback from an investor or something like that, and go, okay, sorry, made a mistake. How can I prevent that next time? How can I be better from now? Right. So it's the people who are super ambitious in trying to solve problems and learn on their own. And it's the people who can make those mistakes, learn from the mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. It's not like anybody's perfect and nobody's perfect. All the people that have these, high functioning startups that have grown into successful businesses, they all make the same mistakes. Everybody makes the same mistakes. But again, it's they've made those mistakes and gone, okay, I'm not going to let this get me down. I'm going to try harder, not remake that mistake. And that's what kind of makes you suited for that startup world.
Yeah, great. No, I completely agree. And then the other thing and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think the other thing as well that people need to realize for a startup is you need to be okay not just doing one singular job.
Of
Like
course.
if your title is software engineer, there's going to be other stuff that you're doing as well. And I think the thing that I always, when I recruited for the startup, I always warned people of, if you're coming in to be a business analyst or a product manager, um, and we ask you to do something else, you can't be the kind of person to be like, "That's not in my job
Your
description."
JD. Yeah, exactly right. So this your what you do on a day-to-day basis in comparison to your JD over time as a business grows becomes much more uniform, right? Because yes, as the company's grown to hundreds of people, you will be judged on your JD, and there isn't as much room to be adaptive, right? Not saying there's never enough room, there should always be enough room. But yes, early people who join startups, yeah, if you called yourself a BD role or a sales role or a support role or something like that, you're absolutely expected to be able to solve all the problems, right? Because who else is it going to go to? Usually companies of that size only have a handful of people. It's not like you can hire another person because you don't have the budget for it. Still needs to be done. Somebody needs to do it. And again, it's this mentality of like, what's the best thing for the business that I can be doing rather than what's the best thing for me. And then if that thing is this task that needs to be done, and you're suited to do it, why not just jump in and do it?
Yeah, great. And actually, it's really funny. It reminds me of we recruited because it touched on what you said before was people who aren't afraid to make mistakes and learn from them. I love that. But some people aren't programmed that way. They're quite analytical. So
Yeah.
I hired a risk analyst to come in and, analyze the risks. And
Yeah.
then they ended up not enjoying being in a startup so much because they would flag all these risks
Yeah,
and say,
exactly.
"Hey,
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
this is
Which
gonna
which
ha-
is
this,
which is there's nothing
yeah,
wrong with that, right? Like that's the thing. There's
yeah,
nothing wrong with that. Different horses for different courses. That just might not be as suited to the startup ecosystem. I was going to say one of my first mentors, like the phrase that he used to use was ask for forgiveness, not for permission when doing things as well. And I love that phrase, right? Like if there's a problem to be solved that needs to be solved, don't waste time in like reaching consensus with a group of people on to do it. Just go and fix it. If it works, no one's going to complain. If it doesn't work, that's okay, right? Like that's the risk we have to take. Again, it's risk. It's all risk.
Yeah, no, perfect. I love that. I try to I guess do that with my wife. Ask for permission,
Yeah,
not
yeah,
forgiveness.
exactly.
When I buy a new surfboard, for example.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah, exactly.
no, it's a great thing. And before we wrap up, I'd love to get your insight for people who go, okay, I want to aim to be a CTO, but let's give them you gave a bit of an insight at the beginning, but could you give us a bit of the pros obviously from your opinion, the pros and cons of now being in that, you know, leadership role
Yep,
so they get a really good understanding?
yep. The pros is you're just involved in a lot more. Again, you're not just involved in your day to day. You're involved in the company, right? So like it's your thing to help shape. You're not the only one that helps shapes it, right? Like there's many people in a leadership position that all contribute together to shape things, and I really like that because what you find in a company, particularly as an individual contributor, you're within guardrails or barriers. For any individual in any role has this, and like you might have ambition, but maybe you can't get through those barriers to pursue that ambition, or maybe you can't talk to your boss's boss about that, right? Certain businesses put red tape up to not enable those things. So I really like being in this position because I'm across all of the stuff in the whole company, and all of the stuff in the whole company contributes to our success, right? So if something in the support team or the sales team or the marketing team, it is, I can view that, I can see that, hey, maybe there's an improvement here that we can do, and I can be involved in that and help them get better as a unit, not just as a stick in my lane. It also means that I work with a lot of people, right? I'm in charge, which I really like. So again, I like standing really broad problem areas and problem spaces and helping others help themselves to work through those things. And it means that I'm in charge of essentially bringing up this next generation of leaders for the company as we grow, right? That can do this themselves as well. And I really like that. Bringing up people to start to think like startup founders, even though maybe they haven't formed startup themselves. That's kind of what we need. Now, the cons here, of course, it's a harder role, right? It's not a 9 to 5 type role, right? It can't be, right? Like you're just in charge of a million different things, and you're across a billion different things. Anything that goes wrong, you'll need to be involved. So there is, stress and strain as part of that. But honestly, I think, and it's super chaotic, right? Like on a day to day basis, you can't plan out your day. I mean, my calendar these days is I probably have 15 or 16 meetings a day every day, right? So 15, 16 meetings every day. And when I was software engineer, I'd have like 3 a week and still complain about it, right? So it's very different levels of things. And even though I have these 15 to 16 meetings, I still have work to do on top of that, right? So it means I'm not working to the 11th hour to finish all my stuff, but you just have to be really effective at your time management, which people do struggle with. So it's like, is this thing that I promised to get done, is it the most important thing now? Now that we've got, some people that potentially could be on performance problems, or maybe we have a security leak in some country, right? Like all of these things are popping up all the time, and you just have to be really dynamic and responsive to those things, which is really hard, right? It is a hard role to manage those bits and pieces, but ultimately, I think like well and truly worth it to be part of the bigger picture and the bigger system, and craft something that I have more responsibility over. I quite enjoy that.
Amazing. It sounds, yeah, like you said, it sounds like not for the faint-hearted, not for somebody who's just looking to clock in at 9 o'clock and leave at 5 p.m. Which, like you said, nothing wrong with that. But
No,
I definitely,
nothing wrong
yeah,
with that. And as a business grows, you need more of those people, right? And that's why you see that come out as a business grows, because that's a super important core. But yeah, particularly in leadership, it does require you, thinking about it after, even if you're not working, right? Like I think about it all the time, just because, not because I want to, I guess, but just because I really enjoy it, to be honest, right? So I enjoy this position and immersing myself in companies and bits and pieces. Yeah, it's kind of my almost my hobby.
Yeah, and I think what people should understand as well, it's not just at that CTO level. I think it's startups in general. Because
Yeah,
like I said, I've worked for one startup, and I was, internal talent there for about 6 months, and it was just different. Like you felt, I guess, the more that you did, and the more that you were a part of it, you're all sort of working towards it, because most startups are going to give you a bit of equity or
yeah,
something
exactly,
within the
exactly,
business to go, hey, look, if we succeed, you're succeeding as well. So it's
exactly.
I agree. I was finishing work, but I was still thinking about, oh well, if we could get this person, then
We
we
can do
could
that,
take
and
it
we can do that. Yeah,
to this level.
exactly. Yes, there's in a startup, there's always an infinite amount of work that can be done, right? Like that's
Yeah.
basically it.
Yeah.
So it's up to you as an individual in that company to basically control how much of that work do you want to personally do or can tolerate without burnout, right? And you kind of navigating that balance all the time. But yeah, I really like that uncomfortable space.
And that will be my last question.
Yeah,
How do you, because I didn't even think about that, how do you manage to avoid
yeah,
burnout,
yeah.
having your brain, I guess, always on?
Yeah. I've gotten better at it over time. So I obviously didn't handle it very well in first startup, right?
Yeah.
Which is what kind of cascaded to that. I was fully immersed in that first startup, working, 7 days a week, 18 hours a day type nasty startup vibe stuff, right? Like I wouldn't do that again. It was useful and basically meant, looking back on it, I earned, let's say, a decade worth of experience in half a decade, right? Because I worked just so much more, which was really valuable, but obviously not good for the long run. For me now, how do I handle it? I'm much more strict with my on and off hours, I would say. I have some flexibility. I really try to actively avoid not working on weekends. That's basically a rule I have now. And I fill my time with things that means I can't work on weekends. So like music stuff in the background, for instance, right? I play a lot of music actively, performing and things like that, which basically fills out this this other side of my life that I can lean on. So when I go to bed or something like that, I don't have to be thinking about work because it's the only thing I enjoy. I also have this other stuff which allows me to separate it a little bit more. And yeah, be open, proactive with your managers, particularly if you're in a bigger startup or bigger companies. Talk about the way you're feeling, and they can genuinely work with you, and it's their job to work with you to manage these things. Yeah, is your health going down? Or there's so many indicators around this stuff, and I think over time I've just become much more attuned to that type of stuff.
It's fantastic. I think that's great that you've come up with a way to avoid it by going, okay, I'm going to force myself to do something else I love, so I have to do it and I can't do
Exactly,
my work.
exactly. And
Right.
again, I only know it from experience because I had many startups where I didn't do that, and I didn't, didn't end up well. But in the ones that I did do that stuff, I was okay, right? So I just kind of learnt over time, but it does work for me.
Great. Oh, well, look, thank you so much for taking the time to give us an overview, I guess, of your role and, what you're doing over at Propeller. Really appreciate it. What we'll do now is we'll hop over to the interviewer insights and get, I guess, a peek behind the curtain of what you do when it comes to the interview process.
Perfect. Thanks, Sam.
Cheers.